let's talk about the power of some giant and spiky fallen nobles in Warhammer 40K with a tier list of Chaos Knight units. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Knights. In this video I thought we'd do an overview of units and datasheets from their Codex and Imperial Armor Index, talking about roughly how they seem to be stacking up in-game. So far it's really not been too long since Chaos Knights have hit the tournament scene. At least initially they seem to be on the upper end of the 40k power spectrum though, really quite high win rates and multiple event wins, though it is early days for them yet, and it looks like, at least from their initial week's performance, it looks like the Lords of Dread, the great big Titanic focused one, landing some really nice objective support with a bunch of useful stratagems and enhancements. That's the one that seems to be leading the way in performance. I would say that literally all the rest of them have some good interest and some good things to draw you to use that detachment more than others. For this one I'll be aiming to rank the Chaos Knight datasheet in terms of power. Obviously tier lists in 40k are all a bit arbitrary. Some things could be ranked a little bit higher or a bit lower. Some things will be on the borderline potentially. And in 10th edition in particular, detachments change things in a big way. In reality, each detachment could have its own tier list, and in particular the Lords of Dread focusing on the Titanic units more than most. The Handpack Lance is obviously going to go big on the War Dogs. I'll try and do a few shout outs to detachments as we go along, and maybe focus a little bit on the Lords of Dread, given that that seems to be the strongest way to play the faction, at least initially. But just for this one I'm going to mainly focus on raw datasheet strength and sort the Chaos Knight units into 4 tiers for a rough appraisal of which ones are some of the best and worst right now. Jumping straight into it, and in tier 4 I'd rate these guys as probably the weakest Chaos Knight datasheets available to the army right now. Basically they're Castus Knights from the Forge World Index and the Cerastus Acheron. The Castus Knights are the really big ones, sort of bridging the gap between Knights and Titans pretty much. There's the Asterius with its big chunky conversion beamers, and then the Porphyrion with its Magna las cannons. Porphyrion is a bit cheaper than the Asterius, 700 points versus 765. That does put them at almost twice the price of even the nearest competitor. That's the Knight Tyrant at 395. You get 30 wounds at toughness 13 for that price tag with a 2+ save. So on an individual basis, really quite tanky and quite resilient to things like las cannons that'll be wounding it on a 5. Then basically enormous walking gun turrets that are kind of slow with an 8-inch move. Both specialise in taking down heavy stuff. The Asterius with 6 attacks at strength 16, AP 2 and damage 6 with twin links, getting sustained hits D3 outside of 24 inches, plus some mortars. The Porphyrion has 2d6, strength 18, AP -4 and damage D6 plus 6 Magna las cannon shots with twin links, plus a missile pod on top. The stats on those weapons and the knights themselves are pretty enormously beefy. In a direct shooting match with some ideal targets, it's probably not going to come out too badly. But on the other hand, if they're playing against an army that isn't rich in good vehicle targets, kind of going to be wasted. Compared with most knight variants, they're going to suffer the most if the opponent decides to hide things behind terrain, as they're not really going to be all that hard to break line of sight on, really focusing just on one big unit and avoiding it, and they can't move that far. They certainly wouldn't enjoy being tagged in melee, as they can't fall back and shoot, so if you tag them in close combat that's going to massively limit their options, or even just moving things forward to move block them a bit. I just feel like for any one given purpose, even direct firepower, you're probably going to be better off with 2 knights rather than 1. Even if you want to be dedicated anti-vehicle and anti-monster, you'll pretty much get a pair of Knight Tyrants with Volcano Lancers, or a pair of Cerastus Atropos. I feel like for units of this sort of size and weight class in Warhammer 40k, they don't generally tend to make them super balanced versus lighter stuff. The other one I've chosen to rank down here is the Cerastus Acheron. This one's the Flame Cannon Knight. Cerastus chassis are the fast-moving ones with a 12-inch movement. A big 28 wounds now at toughness 11, 2 wounds more than the Abhorrence and the Questoris. And again, this one just feels rather directly behind a whole bunch of other options that you might choose, plus 355 points. It's a fairly standard lightly melee weapon with an equivalent of a Reaper chainsword pretty much. The Flame Cannon is a bit of a letdown, it's only short range at 18 inches, and 2d6 strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 with Torrent and ignores cover, because it isn't really that general purpose. The flip cover rule is a nice enough one, but when you've got to dedicate a great big primary weapon for a knight against it, it's not really all that efficient to hand out. Its battle shock rule with War Dogs is a bit clunky and hard to coordinate, and maybe not the most reliable yield if you do. Kind of a shame, as a Cerastus Knight with a great big flamethrower is pretty awesome. I guess the Flamer Knights also suffer from not being able to use Overwatch, unlike Flamers on other vehicles. I would still say that they certainly could be a threatening enough damage profile just in their own right, but just don't really seem to be very well costed as such. Overall, it's basically not completely unusable, but I'd lightly rate it behind every other Cerastus and Abhorrent class Knight. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in the Magnet Baron. They're suppliers of magnets and components for 40k kits and more, having a good supply of high quality M52 magnets. They're based in the USA, so shipping's a touch cheaper there, but they can ship worldwide. I certainly get good use out of magnets myself for my own nightly household. Definitely one of the biggest wins on the magnetizing front for me. Really cool to be able to swap out weapons I quite like magnetising them at the waist for storage, transport and posing as well. Magnet Baron's got a whole bunch of magnets available for that, and a bunch of specific kits that can try and make that easier if you're new to this side of the hobby. Things like this Questoris Knight kit, which comes alongside a whole bunch of 3D printed components, so you can basically magnetise up the entire model without doing any drilling. The instructions are quite good for this one, talking you through each step of the process, and they have a whole bunch of similar ones for the other knights out there, and plenty more traditional kits where it's more just sort of magnets that you do drill in. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. You can find them linked down in the video description if you'd like to check out their stuff. I'll talk about a few of their other things at the end of the video. Let's move onwards and upwards with the datasheets though, and in tier 3 I feel like these ones maybe have a bit more draw, but still probably rate them as overshadowed by the rest. Maybe not quite as likely to see players some in competitive lists, even if they do have some interest. First up, there's the new Knight Ruinator. This one's 350 points, and I would say it basically does feel like an upgrade versus the current Acheron rules and points. Definitely does have some trade-offs. It loses 2 inches worth of move, a little bit of melee, though it gets better against monsters and vehicles a touch, has 2 wounds less, and doesn't have the strip cover thing. For gains though, it is 5 points cheaper, not that's the biggest thing in the world, while it has the same profile for its flame cannon. It also has another quite powerful secondary weapon system in the Terrapulse missiles. They're 2d6 strength 8, AP minus 2 and damage 2 shots. Maybe not absolutely enormous in their own right. It has a secondary weapon system that's really quite a punchy one. For its melee, it's not quite as general purpose as the Reaper Chainsaw or equivalents, but it does get some anti-2 plus keywords on that Fellball. Means it's going to be at least fairly scary against enemy super heavies or Titanic equivalents. And if you can coordinate it into its right target, it's going to have some reroll wound rolls against one nominated victim chosen at the start of the game, and he gets to nominate a new one when the first one's slain. Reroll wounds is a pretty massive buff, particularly with those ranged weapons that are both sort of mid-strength 8. It just feels a touch less reliable given that you might not always be able to coordinate that, and your opponent could have a bit of counterplay in trying to keep them hidden or send them against one of your other units. Finally, it also has quite a good buff for War Dogs, buffing War Dogs for an extra AP minus 1 when they're targeting against the closest unit. As that goes, that's solid enough and is pretty interesting with the War Dog Executioner. AP minus 2 on those auto cannons is so much better than AP 1. Doesn't hurt on the chain cannons either. Overall, between all that, I think it definitely has some interest, though feels like it's a bit weird to have it cost more than the other Abhorrent class chassis. 15 points isn't loads, but it doesn't really feel like it's better. It does come with some downsides as well. The melee is a bit underwhelming compared with the majority of knights out there. It doesn't even really do a particularly great job of being anti-tank and vehicle all that well, not compared with the versions with a damage 8 fist or a lance. Both of the guns not being particularly effective against toughness 9 or more, at least not without the rerolls to wounds. That really doesn't help too much either. It means that it just feels like it's a knight that's going to be kind of hard to use all that well. Weapon profiles that just aren't quite as good as other variants that you might have unless they're going into their optimal targets. Most of the rest tend to be a bit more flexible than the Ruinator. Next up, I've also chosen to rank the Wardog Moirax down here at 150 points. This one's the 4th World Wardog. It does genuinely have some interesting weapon profiles. You can get a claw with a Rad Cleanser built in, which feels like fairly nice added value versus the Slaughter Claw on the other Wardogs, I suppose. Then you've got the choice of a bunch of different weapon profiles on the other arm, essentially some anti-horde with lightning locks, or some fairly punchy conversion beam fire. Despite that, it does have some downsides versus the rest though. It's somewhere between 10 and 20 points more expensive, which definitely doesn't help it. I don't think its datasheet rules particularly stand out. Free heroic intervention just might not always matter all that much depending on what's charging you. It might be kind of rare that you have good opportunities to do it in a meaningful way. It does lack the Havoc pod as well that most of the others get. With a bunch of those, you could stack a fair few, at least armor saves against things that are out of line of sight, which is pretty handy to have for utility if you are running a bunch of War Dogs. Maybe it feels like the bonus Rag Cleanser just isn't that much of a win when you lose that as a trade-off. Overall, definitely not unusable. If you had 10 points that was just spare that you just couldn't spend in any other way, you could think about the upgrade. I just don't really think it's worth 10 points more than the other War Dogs really. It feels more sort of similar value. And finally, for the units that are rated in Tier 3, there's the Knight Megara and Knight Styrex. These have a similar sort of chassis with 26 wounds, toughness 11, and then they get their 5 plus invulnerable save that functions in melee as well. Each of them having their choice of a standard lightning melee weapon between claw and chainsword. Out of the two of them, I'd rate the Megara weaker than the Styrex. I feel like its core weapon, the lightning cannon, just is a bit of a letdown really. AP 0 and damage 2 just isn't super effective against a whole bunch of targets, particularly not with mid-strength. Otherwise, it gives an aura of assault weapons to War Dogs and regenerates D3 wounds a turn, neither of which I'd say are standout support rules. I'd say the Styrex is probably the more interesting one out of the two. It has an Abominant-style Volkite weapon that also has 12 shots now. It was enough to tip it from being a fairly underwhelming gun to being a fairly credible one, even if it's still very swingy. 3 grav shots that can be used to slow down enemy infantry, and an aura of War Dogs ignoring cover. Again, that could be kind of good use for the Warlock Executioner if you wanted to field a few of them around it. Invulnerable save in melee is something though. Out of the two, I'd probably rate the Styrex towards the top of this tier, maybe borderline on tier 2, and the Megara probably on the bottom of this tier. Lightning Cannon just isn't quite as punchy as you'd hope it'd be. Moving up into tier 2, and here are some of the units that are considered to be stronger data sheets for the Chaos Knights, but maybe not right at the very top of the tree. First up, we've got the Knight Tyrant, looking for seriously better, now it's only 395 points. This one just brings really quite a lot of guns and stats for the cost. It's got 28 wounds on the high toughness 12 profile, so it'll be a little bit more robust against las cannon equivalents. As the two loadouts that still rate the Volcano Cannon and Plasma as the more interesting loadout of the two, particularly with the Plasma getting a small buff. Big Flamer and the Harpoon are certainly really quite good fun. I feel like the change of the Harpoon maybe didn't do it all that many favours though when it went from Index to Codex. It gets D3 shots and blast, might be a tiny bit more use against things like medium infantry. Dropping down to just 12-inch range means that it's going to really struggle to get into its targets with an 8-inch move. If it gets tagged in melee where it's going to likely be on the front line, you won't be able to fire the Harpoon into things in there anymore, though I guess you can with the Flamer. The more Castellan pattern one with the Volcano Cannon and the Plasma though, it's just really quite a punchy backfield fire support knight. I'll just really enjoy any damage or defense buffs that you could give for it. Infernal Lance could give you sustained hits 1 on everything. The Mirror of Fates in Lords of Dread is a pretty good one for it. It could allow you to use command point rerolls on the Volcano Lance. Held wound rolls could be a good target for that. Durability ones like the Veil of Medringard for the 4+ invulnerable save, or the Putrid Carapace potentially to give it its 2+ save back and a once per game regenerate. All those are going to be good things. If it wants to go onto full-on Titan Hunter mode as well, there's a 1 command point stratagem in Lord of Dread where you can reroll all 1s to hit and all 1s to wound when targeting monsters and vehicles, going to all hit and wound rolls against Titanics. That's pretty standout between all the guns it can bring to bear. Still say they maybe have their downsides. The 8-inch movement isn't the absolute best, and they're very vulnerable to being tagged in close combat. If it gets locked up there, then its guns won't be able to fire into melee. While it could still stand and shoot at other stuff, it does mean that you wouldn't be able to move before shooting, and that could be a big deal for gaining lines of sight where you actually need them. Next up, we've got the Knight Desecrator with its big anti-tank gun. This one's 335 points, so a nice cheap abhorrent class knight. It gets the standard big punchy weapon choices, the Claw versus Chainsword, and then for its primary weapon it gets the Laser Destructor, getting 3 shots at strength 18, AP -4 and damage d6 +3, all hitting on a 2+ with devastating wounds versus vehicles and monsters. Again, that's also a profile that it could get on quite well with the Mirror of Fates in the Lords of Dread. Otherwise, its special rule is to give you an aura of reroll 1s to hit for War Dogs while shooting. That's easy enough to get some value on for Executioners or Brigands potentially, or maybe Stalkers moving it forward alongside it. Overall, it does feel pretty well rounded, just maybe not quite as flexible as some, dedicating itself a bit more fully to anti-tank duties, but still likely rate it towards the upper end of this tier. Next up, we've got the Cerastus Castigator. Like its brother Cerastus Knights, this one's also 355 points. It gets the boosted chassis with the 28 wounds and the 12-inch movement. This guy's primary weapon is the Bolt Cannon. This one's essentially an Avenger Gatling Cannon with 18 attacks at strength 6 and damage 2. It also gets twin linked on that profile, so it is going to stack a whole bunch more saves on anything between toughness 7 and toughness 11. It's far more than an unbuffed Despoiler Gatling Cannon. Still get on really nicely with the lethal hits or maybe sustained hits from the Infernal one. But already it's just a fairly well-rounded knight. You could see it as a 20-point upgrade on the Despoiler that might arm with a Gatling Cannon and melee weapon. Get twin link on that Gatling Cannon and the boosted Cerastus stat line. Its supporting rules aren't nothing as well. It grants sustained hits 1 to War Dogs at range nearby, so quite a good shooting buff there, and suppresses the enemy hit by the Gatling Cannon for a -1 to hit. It might not always matter, but at least it's something that is a fairly direct value. Overall, I'd say it's solidly usable enough, maybe the main weakness being it just not quite so strong against things that are toughness 7 or more, even despite twin links. Maybe a bit unhelpful that it doesn't have the potential to gain some synergy with the Lords of Dread rerolls one. Finally for this tier, I've ranked a trio of War Dogs. First up, the War Dog Huntsman, so sort of the Armoured Warglaive but painted in Chaos colours. War Dogs running around with their 14 wounds at toughness 9 at the moment, fairly fast and having a reasonable amount of OC to hopefully sacrifice themselves on the mid-board objectives. Be a bit more expendable than the rest of the bigger knights. Huntsman has its 18-inch range Demon Breath Spear, 2 attacks at strength 12 with damage d6 and Melter 4 if you can get within half range of it, plus the Chain Talon with a strike and sweep profile, fairly general purpose against most targets, but not really standout damage in melee. The buff that this guy gets is that it always rerolls wounds versus monsters and vehicles, so it wants to go after the enemy's heavy stuff. That's really quite a big deal, both for the Demon Breath Spear and for its melee. Fairly big hitting damage if it can get into its target, Having more of these will be useful if you're in a very vehicle-heavy matchup. Overall, it feels like it's at least a fairly good rival for the Stalker, that also gets a fairly nice damage buff rule, lacking the option to take the Slaughter Claw and not getting the Scout keyword. I feel puts the Stalker ahead for me. Next up, the Warlord Brigand is 140 points, so it dropped a bit on pre-Codex, but also no longer hits on a 2+ anymore, and the Demon Breath Spear again dropped in range to 18 inches. Backs that up with a chain cannon to ruin some lighter infantry's day, and can take a Havoc pod on top. Still a fairly nice general purpose gun turret, but needs to get a bit closer than it would have done before. It's fairly solid mid-range fire support. It gets to ignore cover when it's shooting against things on objectives as well, which feels like it'd come off often enough to make some impact, but isn't exactly guaranteed. It could be interesting fire support for a mid-range knight in the hand-packed lance. It's one that could fairly easily get some advantage out of the sustained hits buff when you focus down one target potentially. Plenty of the big knights can buff range in one way or the other, whether it's advance and shoot, reroll ones to hit, sustained hits or more. Finally for this tier, we've got the War Dog Executioner. This one's the Armored Helver in Pattern 1 with a bunch of Strength 9, AP 1 and Damage 3 autocannons with good range. It also has the advantage of being the cheapest War Dog, so maybe between that, not really the worst one to be loitering around in the home field, taking up some place and screening out some of the board, while still being able to contribute to the game. The autocannons can be quite good against targets that rely on invulnerable saves as opposed to armor saves to stay safe, but the low AP is a bit of a problem. Means that anything with a 3+ or 2+ save and getting cover, the War Dogs just aren't going to do too much damage against them. So it particularly gets on well with anything that can help them out on that front. Maybe the Ruinator for the AP buff, or ignores cover from the Styrex. Those two could be a bit more standout with some executioners there. Stage sheet rule isn't really the biggest one. The damage buff below half strength is situational, and if it wipes out a unit, it can trigger some battle shock nearby. Though I feel like it's not really reliable enough to plan big around. While they will kill things from time to time, they don't really feel like the sort of thing that you can ever guarantee is going to finish off one target. It also doesn't get a Havoc missile pod as well, which I feel like is a small downside as well, even if you can still chip away with some shots with a stubber. Overall, I still rate them as usable, maybe towards the lower end of this tier. Being cheap and long range are some genuine positives though. I certainly not expect them to see play quite as much as some of the War Dogs in the top tier. Moving on to Tier 1 though, here are some of the Chaos Knights I'd rate as some of the strongest stage sheets around at the moment. And first up we have the cheapest Titanic Knight in the Abominant, that seems to have done rather well in the transition into the Codex. Being the single cheapest knight is definitely an advantage, and if you want to play 6 Knights Lord of Dreads, basically one of them mathematically has to be an Abominant. If trying to shave off some extra points for enhancements in one way or another in other lists, it could also be one draw to run this as opposed to other classes. For its melee, gets a whole bunch of Strength 10, AP 2 and Damage 3 attacks with sustained hits, plus a Bale Mace tail. It does mean it's not quite so good against its Titanic rivals, though should solely bully anything on the lighter side of the spectrum, including Terminator equivalents. In Lords of Dread, it can still use that reroll stratagem of ones to hit and wound if it needs to desperately hit some vehicles or Titanic stuff hard though. In Infernal Lance, it might enjoy the lethal hits on the Bale Mace for that reason to help it out if it does have to target one of those. Will be quite good for the sort of durability option, have it move forward as a cheaper and more expendable knight into the mid board, and then suddenly make it tougher to kill. Will be a really relevant one in the Traitorous Lance as well, given that it hands out more battle shock tests, and if you're trying to stat the dread abilities super high, it's going to be one of the easiest ways to control having a few extra battle shock tests going off on the enemy's most important units. Battle shock ability is kind of relevant, as it's just a slightly better chance of making some units fail, maybe a bit more relevant after you've got some more of the dread abilities going, maybe from turn 3 onwards. If it can translate into your Chaos Knights having a +1 to wound against one target, that's pretty big. Its other special rule gives you an aura of mortal wounds going off on enemy units nearby at the end of its movement phase on the roll of a 3+ per unit. You could potentially have multiple Abominants moving up the board in a big Titanic Knight heavy list, maybe making enemies roll multiple times for that, where you could really chip away at squads even if you can't see or interact with them behind ruins or something. Finally, its Volkite gun got a nice improvement in the Codex, gaining an extra 3 shots. I feel like that's now enough to make it far more on par with the other knightly shooting weapons. Big 12 shots at strength 12, AP 0, damage 3 and devastating wounds is a weird profile. With all that shooting, there's a good chance that you get 1 or 2 devastating wounds and stack a bunch of saves on the enemy besides. It just could be really quite swingy depending on you roll high or how your opponent rolls their saves. Overall seems like a solidly efficient knight for 325 points though. Next up, we've got the Flexible Knight Despoiler. This one's basically the Chaos version of the Knight Questoris, using things like the Battle Cannon, Gatling Cannon, and Thermal Cannon. It has the option for a top-mounted carapace weapon, most people going for the Ruin Storm direct fire missiles. The single most popular loadout for this one is the Dual Gatling Cannon one, which is just fairly brutal and fantastically general purpose. Between two Gatling cannons, you get a fairly ludicrous 36 strength 6, AP minus 2 and damage 2 shots, which will just absolutely obliterate Space Marine equivalents and do loads of hurts to Terminators or certainly anything lighter. It's quite a nice advantage that it can blaze away with them pretty happily in melee as well, also buffed by having two underslung heavy flamers as well, just in case you needed even more anti-infantry. This one got a big buff in the Chaos Knight Codex though, as well as dropping in cost while still having basically the same damage output. The detachments can allow it to punch up far better. Again, Lords of Dread can have the reroll stratagem against monsters and vehicles. Reroll ones to hit and wound are nice enough, but if it does happen to be going against Titanic Knight equivalents that are toughness 11, you can use one command point for fully reroll all hits and wounds against its target, which gives it pretty reliable chances of just leaving it on a few wounds left. Warpborn Stalker enhancement could be quite nice for it in Lords of Dread as well, to get it lines of sight on things that it wants. Infernal could also be really interesting as well though. That one means that you can just flex into 3 lethal hits. All those mid-strength shots remain absolutely murderous against tough stuff, or just double down with sustained against lighter things, and the ignored cover stratagem is pretty nice with the AP2 as well. I'd rate that as the single strongest one, though I feel like the other loadouts also do work fine. You could go for a melee weapon and Gatling cannon or one of the other weapons. Its main datasheet rule gives you a single reroll that you could use for a hit or wound roll. That could have a pretty good effect on a knightly melee weapon that otherwise you wouldn't be getting. The rule also feels like there's multiple ways to use it. I guess you might be weighing it up against some contenders like the Knight Desecrator and Atropos if you want a sort of hybrid range and melee build. Next up, we've got the brutal melee machine that is the Knight Rampager, also a very cheap knight at 335 points. This one can just surge towards the enemy unusually fast and hit them apocalyptically hard when it gets there. It goes faster than most with its 12-inch move, being able to smash straight through terrain pieces is a big deal. Then its melee damage is just absolutely monstrous. 6 attacks at strength 20, AP minus 3 and damage 8, and then the choice of 2 different sweep profiles depending on whether you want damage 3 or damage 2. Also a similar high number of attacks hitting on a 2+. All of those attacks just get sustained hits all the time at base now, so you're likely to get as many hits as you have attacks. On top of that, it even gets devastating wounds on the charge as well, so locking out with a big invulnerable save isn't always going to be an option. For the cheap points cost that it is, it's really hard to go too far wrong with, throwing itself towards the enemy front lines, hopefully breaking something important, and then demanding that it takes a lot of fire to deal with, otherwise more things get broken. And it does have some nice options with the Lords of Dread. Quite enjoy the Throne Mechanicum of Skulls, the one that allows you a once per game advance and charge, or the Blade of Celerity for a once per game fights first. If the opponent's a melee army, then that's probably going to cause some problems. It would also be quite a nice option for Spiteful Demise as well. Chance to run into the midst of the enemy army and blow up on a 4+ when it dies. Both the -1 damage and rerolls ones could be useful as well. There's plenty more for it in other detachments of course as well, maybe the +3-inch move in Infernal, or tanky extra damage with the Veil of Medringard in the Traitorous Lance. Maybe the single biggest rival for the Rampager in melee is the Knight Lancer. This one's 20 points more, does get some big advantages for that, but also makes some trade-offs and doesn't have quite the same amount of carnage causing melee damage. As with the rest of the Cerastus, it has +2 wounds and +2 movement, so it moves even faster than the Rampager with a 14-inch move. It has fairly punchy melee damage, though not quite as much as the Rampager. It gets 5 attacks at strength 20, AP 3 and damage 8. It gets Lance on that profile though, so a bit better against tough stuff, and also a free tank shock definitely doesn't hurt. Besides that though, its single biggest selling point is the big 4+ invulnerable save that it gets from that shield. It's going to be extra tanky both at range and in melee. Melee often being one of the best places to try and deal with knights. Basically all the Lords of Dread things that the Rampager likes, this will mainly like too. Again, the advance and charge with Throne Mechanicum. Blessing of the Dark Master could be a particularly nice one to cancel out the damage of something that just breached its armor. It could be good for the Mirror of Fates with multiple uses for a command point that could matter really big, whether it's damage or saves. Command point debuff aura could also be quite nice on it as well to interfere with the enemy plans as it moves up. Overall, it's definitely got a lot of things going for it, and it's really quite cheap like the rest of the knights at the moment. It might also be a pretty reasonable option if you're trying to counter enemy knights with your own, which definitely seems possible with how popular they've been after their updates. That's the same as that goes for the Knight Atropos, the last of the Cerastus Knights. This one's also 355 points, 28 wounds with the 12-inch move. This one also has an invulnerable save that works in melee as well, getting a 5+1 though rather than a 4+. This one's got some interesting shooting and melee profiles though, feeling maybe just a little bit standout dangerous on both. Two punchy guns that work pretty well against heavies with the Grav plus the Lascutter, and doubling down on that with a +1 to hit versus any monsters and vehicles it might target, and also getting a +1 to wound against Titanics as well, so again very good for countering its enemy Questoris. Lascut is also pretty solid at taking down tough stuff in close combat as well, getting more attacks and sustained hits to compensate for a lower damage. Isn't quite a standout against sort of medium to heavy infantry compared with some. It also gets the same buffing rules as there, so again it's going to be a specialist at taking down tough stuff. His other buffing rule is to help out War Dogs versus Titanics. It's a fairly standout dangerous knight, both at range and is good in melee. It works well with most of the Lord of Dread enhancements. Again, the Mirror of Fates, Warpborn Stalker and things. Again, could also absolutely double down with the big reroll strats against monsters and vehicles, as it's already very efficient against them. Overall, certainly feels like a solid all-rounder, hard to go too far wrong with. Being slightly harder to take down with 28 wounds and the 5+ invulnerable save in melee don't hurt. Next up, I've chosen to rank a couple of War Dogs here. Perhaps out of the two, I think I'd rate the Stalker a bit below the Carnivore. The Stalker is just a bit more interesting for having the Scout keyword on top of its profile. Stalker is the flexible mixed role War Dog, often taking the damage 6+2 Slaughter Claw, then backing that up with its choice of a Chain Cannon or a great big Demon Breath Melter weapon. Scout 6 inches makes it just super helpful for jumping into the mid board and fighting for the midfield objectives nice and early. It could potentially give you the chance to react to who gets first turn, maybe trying to hide if it's the enemy turn or go aggressive if it's yours. And like the Huntsman, it also gets a fairly useful damage buff. This one's a +1 to wound enemies that aren't near other enemies. Provided they're 6 inches away, then you can get that, so it could potentially affect everything, but it's going to be dependent on how they've set up their army. One of the ones that gets a Havoc Pod as well. Like between Scout, its multiple useful weapon profiles, and a good damage buff, it's kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Be slightly diminishing returns after you've had one or two of them, though, to get some presence in the midboard. I still likely rate it just a bit lower than the War Dog Carnivore, though. I still be putting that one as the single most standout War Dog after the rules updates. Still 140 points and moving super fast with a 14-inch move, being able to re-roll advance and charges to try and get that melee where it needs to be. And then when it gets there, it didn't really lose any damage output in the Codex. 6 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6+2. Now hitting on a 3+, but with sustained hits 1, so it kind of cancels out there. Or having some sweet profiles with damage 1 if that makes more sense. They could move 17 inches in Infernal Lance if they needed to, or pay 1 command points to have multiple of them walk through walls in Traitorous Lance to get into their prey. Also get Havoc Pods to chip away with a bit of indirect fire as they set up their charges. And overall, just with that much damage threats, they feel maybe in best place to trade units on mid-board objectives, again being far more expendable than the big knights if the opponent has to charge and get their damage into something. They do seem to be the go-to one in choice in competitive army lists if you're wanting War Dogs to support the big knights. Like the rest, they also have some good stratagem support in the Helmpat Lance. Maybe not ideal that they overlap with the detachment rule for their melee profile though. Finally, and probably worth giving a shout out, given that they're just so useful to have as a small number for knightly armies, are a couple of Chaos Demons. Two that to pick out as having the most value right now are the Nurglings and the Beasts of Nurgle. Chaos Demons, you need to have a battle line choice to unlock other choices, and Nurglings are battle line and maybe the easiest thing to unlock Nurgle datasheets with. A small investment at 40 points, they can infiltrate to start in the mid-board, and that's really quite good for board control, meaning that enemy infiltrators can't deploy near them within 9 inches, and they also won't be able to scout within 9 inches of you either. It can be quite a big deal for knights, given that you don't want to get boxed in and have the knights pressed into their own deployment zone. They generally want to be moving forward and getting to grips and destroying the enemy army as fast as possible. It could just be used to deep strike screen an area of the board, or deep strike themselves to do that, maybe even achieve certain secondaries at the same time. They can do things like engage on all fronts or behind enemy lines. Otherwise, and often taking up residence in the slot that's opened up with Nurglings are the Beasts of Nurgle. 65 points for a cheap annoying scout unit. Again, just nice to have something that's a lot less expensive than War Dogs to act as a sort of sacrificial screening and placeholder style unit, or to do grunt work like certain secondary objective actions. Beasts of Nurgle are pretty great for that role. They can move into the midboard to take up in residence somewhere where the opponent can't shoot them so well. Be ready to do secondaries, maybe do nuisance charges, again do screening style things. If they ever get into positional fights where they're just scrapping with one unit of enemy objective grabbers, those objective grabbers are going to be unlikely to be able to destroy the beast, as they'll just regenerate back to full health each turn. There's definitely other stuff that could be interesting as well, maybe depending on whether or not you want to pay the tax of the battle line units to unlock other stuff. I've seen some people using Rottagers both before and after the Knights Codex update, as to have another big tough unit to absorb a ton of fire. In any case though, that just about brings us to the end of a Chaos Knight tier list. Let me know your thoughts as to the units talked about. Would you have rated any of them higher or lower than I have? And let me know why down in the comments. As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to the Magnet Baron for sponsoring this one. They're a US-based supplier of all things for magnets. They've got things like this magnetizing starter bundle with a bunch of drill bits, super glue, applicators, and some magnets to get you started. They've got all sorts of sizes and shapes of magnets, any one that a project might need. Plus, they've got some helpful ones that are the exact right height for citadel bases. I believe they're around about 2.2 millimeters. As mentioned, they've got their specific tailored 40K kits, such as the No Drill Questoris Knight kits, with a bunch of 3D printed components to mount the magnets in. Lots of other similar ones for various different ones, some a bit more or less technical versus others. Finally, they also have some flight stands available as well. That's another really common 40K problem that I've often tended to magnetize myself in the past, and have some pre-made ones to mount your miniatures on. In any case, if you'd like to take a look over their stuff, check them out, links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40K videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, the channel's Patreon page is linked down in the video description. That one has a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.